In a cramped suburban kitchen, a 78-year-old former professor was about to face the most devastating question of her life. What started as a heated family argument took a shocking turn when her granddaughter asked, "Why don't you just die already?" Eleanor Matthews wasn't your typical grandmother. For 4 decades, she had shaped young minds as a literature professor, known for finding wisdom in darkness. When she encountered Maya's cruel words, Eleanor had no idea this moment would define their relationship forever. Her measured response would lead to a family reckoning that transformed them all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The kitchen counter pressed against Eleanor's ribcage as she gripped its edge, her left hand trembling slightly as she reached for the coffee mug. The simple act of pouring coffee, something she'd done thousands of times in her 78 years, now required the careful coordination of a surgeon. Her right side, still weak from the stroke 8 months ago, betrayed her with its stubborn refusal to cooperate. "Here, Mom." Rebecca's voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd been awake since 5:30, already dressed in her blue scrubs, her nurse's badge clipped to her pocket. She moved with efficient precision, steadying Eleanor's grip on the mug, while simultaneously scanning the kitchen for Maya's scattered college application materials. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I can manage. I know you can." Rebecca's tone held the practiced patience of someone who'd had this conversation daily for months. "But you don't have to." The words stung more than Rebecca probably intended. Eleanor had spent her career teaching literature students about the power of subtext, the meanings that lived between the lines. She recognized the unspoken message now. "You're not capable anymore. You're our responsibility." From the living room came the mechanical whir of the hospital bed Rebecca had rented, positioned where the coffee table used to be. Eleanor's physical therapy equipment, resistance bands, foam rollers, a walker she despised, created an obstacle course in what had once been a welcoming family space. The house felt smaller each day, as if the walls were slowly contracting around them all. "Maya!" Rebecca's voice cut through the morning air as she spotted college brochures scattered across Eleanor's therapy mat. "What did I tell you about leaving your stuff on Grandma's equipment?" Maya burst through the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. At 16, she moved with the kinetic energy of someone always on the verge of flight. "I needed more space to spread everything out. The kitchen table is covered with Grand's pill organizers and that stupid speech therapy workbook." "That stupid workbook is helping your grandmother recover her speech," Rebecca snapped, then immediately looked stricken. These moments of irritation followed by guilt had become a pattern, Eleanor noticed. Rebecca carried her exhaustion like a weight that grew heavier each day. Eleanor watched her granddaughter's face crumple slightly at the reprimand. Maya had been her closest companion before the stroke, the one who'd curl up beside her for hours, discussing books and dreams and the mysteries of growing up. Now Maya looked at her with a mixture of love and something else Eleanor couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps. Or resentment. "I'm sorry," Maya muttered, gathering her papers with jerky movements. There's nowhere else to put anything. This house is what?" Rebecca's tone held a warning. Maya's mouth opened, then closed. Tense. Eleanor could see the words fighting to escape. Too small, too crowded, too much like a nursing home. Instead, Maya shook her head and retreated toward the stairs. David appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. At 18, he possessed a calmness that seemed impossible for someone his age. Home from college for winter break, he'd immediately assumed the role of family mediator, a position that shouldn't have fallen to him, Eleanor knew, but one he handled with grace that reminded her painfully of her late husband. "Morning, Gran." He kissed her forehead, then moved to help with her physical therapy exercises without being asked. "Ready for your shoulder stretches?" Eleanor nodded, grateful for his steady presence. David understood her condition better than the others. His pre-med studies had given him insight into stroke recovery that made him the most patient of her caregivers. He guided her through the arm movements with gentle precision, neither hovering nor rushing. "That's it," he murmured as Eleanor raised her right arm, fighting against the persistent weakness. "You're getting stronger. I can see the difference from last week." The encouragement felt genuine, not the forced cheerfulness Rebecca sometimes employed. Eleanor had taught David to read when he was 4, had watched him devour book after book with the same hunger she'd once possessed. Now he was taking care of her, and the reversal of roles left her feeling unmoored. Rebecca bustled around them, preparing for her shift at the hospital. "I'll be late tonight. Double shift. David, can you help Maya with her Northwestern application? The deadline is tomorrow." "Northwestern?" Eleanor's voice still carried the slight slur that frustrated her, but her mind remained sharp. "That's a reach school. What about her safety options?" Maya's head snapped up from where she'd been organizing her papers on the floor. "Safety options. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Gran. I didn't mean—" Eleanor began, but Maya was already moving toward the phone that had been ringing insistently on the counter. "Hello?" Maya's voice took on the particular tone teenagers used with friends, lighter, more animated than the voice she'd been using with her family. "Oh my God, Sarah, you won't believe what happened with the Stanford application." Eleanor tried to focus on her exercises, but Maya's voice carried across the small space. "I know, right? The whole process is insane. I swear, living here is like being in a nursing home. I can't even think straight with all the medical equipment and pill schedules and therapy appointments." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She fumbled the resistance band David had handed her, her coordination faltering along with her composure. David's hand touched her shoulder gently. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds," he said quietly. But Eleanor knew Maya meant exactly what she'd said. The house had become medicalized, institutionalized. Eleanor's presence had transformed their home into something clinical and constrained. She saw it in Rebecca's exhausted efficiency, in Maya's need to escape to her room, in David's careful diplomacy. "I'm making everyone miserable," Eleanor whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That's not true." David's voice held conviction, but Eleanor caught the slight hesitation, the way his eyes flickered toward his mother's tense shoulders. Rebecca appeared at Eleanor's side, her face flushed with the particular stress of running late. "Mom, don't listen to Maya. She's just overwhelmed with college applications. We all are. We all are." The words confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. She wasn't just recovering from her stroke. She was the source of the family's overwhelming stress. She'd become the problem they all had to solve, the burden they all had to bear. Maya ended her phone call and turned back to the family, her expression defensive. "Can we please just focus on getting through today? I have that interview at 3, and I still need to review my essay, and I can't concentrate with everyone hovering and—" "Nobody's hovering," Rebecca interrupted. "We're just trying to help." "Help with what? I'm not the one who needs help." Maya's voice rose slightly, then she caught herself, glancing at Eleanor with what might have been guilt. The silence that followed felt thick with unspoken tensions. Eleanor gripped her coffee mug tighter, feeling the tremor in her left hand intensify. She'd built her life around words, around the precise use of language to convey meaning and emotion. Now, even her speech betrayed her, leaving her thoughts tangled and unclear. David cleared his throat. "Why don't we—" "I'm fine," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm going to rest before Sarah comes for therapy." She stood carefully, using the walker she despised, and made her way toward the hospital bed in the living room. Behind her, she could hear Rebecca organizing Maya's college materials, David offering to help with the interview preparation, the family trying to restore normalcy to their fractured morning. But Eleanor understood what they were all too polite to say. Her presence had fundamentally altered the fabric of their lives. She'd become the stone thrown into still water, and the ripples of her need were spreading outward, touching everything. As she settled onto the hospital bed, Eleanor gazed around the living room that was no longer quite a living room. The medical equipment, the pill organizers, the careful modifications Rebecca had made to accommodate her limitations, it all told the story of a family adjusting to permanent change. Living here is like being in a nursing home. Maya's words echoed in her mind, and Eleanor couldn't deny their truth. She turned their home into exactly what her granddaughter had said. The question was, what could she do about it? Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of her family preparing for their day. Rebecca's keys jingling as she gathered her things. David's gentle voice encouraging Maya about her interview. The front door opening and closing as Rebecca left for work. Soon, the house would settle into its daytime quiet, and Eleanor would be alone with her thoughts and her growing certainty that love sometimes meant making the hardest choices of all. The morning sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Eleanor watched them move in their random patterns, thinking about the delicate balance of forces that kept them suspended. Such a fragile dance, she mused, so easily disrupted by the slightest change in pressure. Just like families, she thought. Just like life itself. The late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the dinner table where rejection had taken physical form. The thin envelope from Northwestern University lay beside Maya's plate like an accusation, its contents having drained the color from her face hours earlier. Eleanor watched her granddaughter push food around her plate with mechanical precision, each movement sharp, with barely contained frustration. Rebecca had insisted on a family dinner despite the tension that had simmered since morning, her nurse's instinct telling her that routine might somehow hold their fracturing household together. The interview went well, Maya said suddenly, her voice hollow. Mrs. Henderson said I presented my ideas clearly. Fat lot of good it did. David looked up from his pasta. One rejection doesn't define anything, Maya. You've got 6 other applications pending. 6 other schools that will probably say the same thing. Maya's fork clattered against her plate. Do you know what Northwestern's acceptance rate is? 8%. 8. And I thought I had a chance. Eleanor set down her own fork carefully, her left hand steadier than it had been that morning. When I was your age, when you were my age, college cost $300 a semester, and you could walk into any job with a handshake. Maya's interruption carried a bitter edge that made Rebecca wince. Maya, Rebecca warned, but Eleanor raised her hand slightly. You're right, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the measured tone she'd once used in lecture halls. The world was different then. But disappointment. Disappointment is universal. Maya's laugh held no humor. Is this going to be one of those stories about how you walked uphill, both ways to school? Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. A familiar sensation from her teaching days when a student's defensiveness signaled deeper pain. No, this is about the time I was rejected from every graduate program I applied to. Twice. The table fell quiet. Even Rebecca, who thought she knew all her mother's stories, looked surprised. I wanted to study at Columbia, Eleanor continued, her speech growing clearer as she found her rhythm. I was so certain of my path. I had recommendations from my professors, good grades, a thesis proposal I'd worked on for months. When the rejection came, I felt like my entire future had been erased. Maya's hostility wavered slightly, replaced by reluctant curiosity. What did you do? I taught high school for 2 years, saved money, rewrote my thesis, applied again. Eleanor's eyes found Maya's across the table. The second round of rejections nearly broke me. I remember sitting in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by rejection letters, wondering if I was delusional to think I could be a scholar. David leaned forward. But you did become a professor. You got your PhD from a state school that wasn't my first choice, or my second, or my third. Eleanor's smile held the wisdom of decades. I learned that success isn't about getting everything you want when you want it. It's about discovering what you're truly capable of when your first plan fails. Maya's fork paused halfway to her mouth. That's not the same thing, Gran. You don't understand how competitive everything is now. How much pressure. Pressure? Eleanor's voice sharpened slightly. You think pressure is new? You think your generation invented stress? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Rebecca recognized the tone, her mother's professor voice, the one that had commanded attention in countless classrooms. You sit there with your college applications spread across my therapy equipment, Eleanor continued, complaining about having to tiptoe around my needs, talking about how this house feels like a nursing home. You think pressure is writing essays and attending interviews? Maya's face flushed red. I never said. You said it to Sarah on the phone this morning. You think I didn't hear? Eleanor's words came faster now, 40 years of teaching authority backing each syllable. You want to know about pressure? Try rebuilding your entire life at 78. Try relearning how to speak, how to write, how to walk. Try watching your independence disappear piece by piece while your family treats you like a burden to be managed. Mom, Rebecca interjected, but Eleanor was finding her stride. Try watching your granddaughter, the one person who used to look at you with pure love, roll her eyes every time you need help. Try feeling like a stranger in your own daughter's home because your presence has turned it into a medical facility. Maya's eyes began to glisten, but her jaw remained set. I never asked for any of this. I never asked for you to get sick. I never asked for my life to be turned upside down because you can't take care of yourself anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke. David's intake of breath was audible. Rebecca's hand moved to her chest as if she'd been physically struck. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her training as an educator warring with her pain as a grandmother. She'd seen this before in her students, the moment when fear and frustration transformed into cruelty. So what are you suggesting? Eleanor asked quietly. That I should have stayed in the hospital? Gone to a nursing home? Maybe. Maya's voice broke slightly on the word, but she pushed forward. Maybe that would have been better for everyone. Maya! Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. But Maya was beyond stopping now, months of resentment and terror pouring out in a torrent. Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love disappear? To see them struggle with things that used to be simple? To feel guilty because sometimes you wish things could go back to how they were? Eleanor felt her heart breaking, not from Maya's words, but from the pain underneath them. This was grief, she realized. Maya was mourning the grandmother she'd lost to the stroke, and she didn't know how to process that loss. You want to know what pressure feels like? Maya continued, her voice rising. It's watching your grandmother, the smartest person you know, struggle to pour coffee. It's pretending everything is fine when nothing is fine. It's feeling selfish because you want your life back. Maya, stop! David's voice held a warning, but Maya was beyond hearing. It's being afraid every day that you're going to get worse. That one day I'll come home and find you. And the worst part is, sometimes I think it would be easier if… If what? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Maya's face was streaked with tears now, her composure completely shattered. If you would just… Why don't you just die already? The question exploded into the silence like a gunshot. David's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. Maya's own eyes widened in horror at what she'd said. Eleanor sat frozen, the words echoing in her mind. Why don't you just die already? The question she'd been asking herself in the dark hours of the night, when the weight of her dependence felt unbearable. The question that had lived in the spaces between her family's careful kindness. Maya immediately began to backtrack, her voice desperate. I didn't mean… I don't actually want… Gran, I'm sorry, I didn't. But Eleanor held up her hand, the gesture somehow carrying more authority than any words could. The kitchen fell into absolute silence, broken only by the tick of the wall clock and Maya's shuddering breaths. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, really looked at her, and saw not cruelty but a 16-year-old girl drowning in emotions she didn't know how to navigate. She saw fear and love twisted together into something that had momentarily become toxic. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, for asking the question I've been too afraid to ask myself. Maya's sob caught in her throat. Rebecca reached across the table, but Eleanor shook her head gently. Tomorrow, Eleanor continued, I'll give you an answer, a real answer. But tonight, I think we all need to sit with what's been said. She stood carefully, using the table for support, rather than her hated walker. As she made her way toward the living room, she paused beside Maya's chair. You're not selfish for wanting your life back, Eleanor said softly. You're human, and I love you enough to want you to have it. The words hung in the air as Eleanor disappeared into the next room, leaving behind a family shattered by honesty and the terrible weight of a question that demanded an answer. The silence that followed Eleanor's exit felt like a living thing, pressing down on the kitchen with suffocating weight. Maya sat frozen in her chair, her face streaked with tears, staring at the space where her grandmother had been standing moments before. The words she'd spoken, "Why don't you just die already?" seemed to echo endlessly in the air, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. David was the first to move, his chair scraping against the linoleum as he stood. His face had gone pale, his usual calm composure cracked like ice under pressure. "Maya, what the hell is wrong with you?" "I didn't mean it," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean it like that." "How else could you mean it?" David's voice rose, something he rarely allowed to happen. "How else could you possibly mean asking our grandmother why she doesn't just die?" Rebecca reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched Maya's wrist. "Honey, you need to—" "Don't." Maya jerked away from her mother's touch, standing abruptly. Her chair tilted backward, nearly falling before David caught it. "Don't touch me. Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" Rebecca's voice cracked. "Like I'm a monster." Maya's hands shook as she wiped her face. "I know what I said. I know how horrible it was. But you don't understand what it's like to— To what?" David stepped closer, his medical training warring with his role as protective older brother. "To watch someone you love struggle? To see them need help? Because, newsflash, Maya, we're all watching. We're all struggling. But somehow the rest of us managed not to tell Gran she should be dead." Maya flinched as if he'd struck her. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself for saying it? Then why did you say it?" David's voice held genuine bewilderment. "Why would you ever say something like that to her?" Maya's face crumpled. "Because I'm scared, okay? I'm terrified every single day that she's going to get worse. That one morning I'll wake up and she won't remember who I am. That she'll have another stroke. And this time—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rebecca stood slowly, her nursing instincts taking over despite her emotional turmoil. "Maya, sweetheart, fear doesn't excuse." "I know it doesn't excuse anything." Maya's voice broke completely. "I know I'm a terrible person. I know I'm selfish and cruel and—" "You're not terrible," Rebecca said firmly. "You're 16 and dealing with something most adults can't handle. But that doesn't make what you said okay." Maya wrapped her arms around herself, looking younger than her years. "I used to think Gran was invincible. When I was little, she seemed like she knew everything, could do anything. She was the one who taught me to read, who explained math problems when I was frustrated, who listened to all my stupid teenage problems like they were the most important things in the world." David's anger began to soften as he recognized the grief in his sister's voice. "She's still that person, Maya. The stroke didn't change who she is inside. But it changed everything else." Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "The way she struggles with words sometimes. The way she needs help with things that used to be simple. The way she looks at us when she thinks we're not watching, like she's apologizing for existing." Quote. Rebecca felt her heart break a little more. "Is that why you said it? Because you thought she was suffering?" Maya shook her head violently. "No, I said it because I'm a coward. Because I can't handle watching her struggle. Because sometimes I look at her and I think about how much easier everything would be if she just—" She trailed off, unable to voice the thought again. "If she just what?" David pressed gently. "If she just went back to being the grandmother I remember. Or if she—" Maya's voice dropped to a whisper. "If she died before I have to watch her get worse." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Rebecca reached for Maya again, and this time her daughter didn't pull away. "Oh, honey," Rebecca murmured, pulling Maya into her arms. "Those thoughts don't make you a monster. They make you human." "They make me horrible," Maya sobbed against her mother's shoulder. "What kind of person wishes their grandmother would die?" "The kind who loves her too much to want to see her suffer," David said quietly. "The kind who's grieving the person they lost, even though she's still here." Maya pulled back to look at him. "You feel it too?" David nodded reluctantly. "Sometimes. When I see her struggling with her physical therapy, or when her speech gets unclear and she gets frustrated, I miss the grandmother who could lecture for hours about Shakespeare without missing a beat." But Maya, missing who she was, doesn't mean we stop loving who she is now. But I hurt her, Maya whispered. I said the cruelest thing I could think of, and I said it to the person who loves me most in the world. Rebecca stroked Maya's hair. Yes, you did. And you're gonna have to live with that. But you're also gonna have to figure out how to make it right. How do I make something like that right? Maya's voice was filled with despair. How do I take back words like that? You don't, David said simply. You can't take them back, but you can choose what you do next. Maya looked toward the living room, where they could hear the soft sounds of Eleanor settling into her hospital bed. She said she'd give me an answer tomorrow, an answer to my question. Are you going to be able to handle whatever she says? Rebecca asked gently. Maya's face crumpled again. What if she says yes? What if she says she wants to die, because of what I said? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then you'll have to live with that, David said, his voice gentler now. But Maya, I don't think that's what she's going to say. How can you be sure? Because I know, Gran. She's not going to let your words, no matter how hurtful, define her choices about her own life. If anything, she's probably going to use this as a teaching moment. Maya let out a shaky laugh. Even now, she's trying to educate me. That's who she is, Rebecca said. That's who she's always been. The stroke didn't change that. Maya pulled away from her mother's embrace, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I need to apologize to her. Yes, you do, David agreed. But maybe not tonight. Maybe let her process what happened first. What if she won't forgive me? Rebecca's voice was firm. She will. It might take time, but she will. Because she loves you, Maya. And love doesn't disappear because of words spoken in anger. Maya nodded, though she didn't look convinced. I should start cleaning up my college stuff. Get it off her therapy equipment. That's a good start, David said. As Maya began gathering her scattered application materials, Rebecca found herself thinking about her mother's words at dinner. You think your generation invented stress? Eleanor had been right. The family had been so focused on their own struggles that they'd forgotten she was struggling too. Mom, Maya said suddenly, looking up from her papers. Do you think I'm like Dad? Rebecca's breath caught. Maya rarely mentioned her father directly, and when she did, it was usually with carefully controlled emotion. What do you mean? Dad always said things when he was angry, things that cut deep. Remember how he used to tell you that you were wasting your intelligence on nursing? That you could have been something more important? Rebecca felt old wounds reopen. You're nothing like your father, Maya. But I am. I said something cruel to someone I love. Just like he did. I attacked the person who was trying to help me. Just like he did. David moved closer to his sister. No, Maya. Dad said those things because he wanted to control Mom, to make her feel small. You said what you said because you're scared and hurting. The words might have been equally hurtful, but the intent was different. Does intent matter when the damage is done? Yes, Rebecca said firmly. It matters because it determines whether you can heal from this or whether it becomes a pattern. Your father never tried to make amends. He never felt genuine remorse. You're already showing more emotional maturity than he ever did. Maya looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about all the times Gran defended me when I was little. When I got in trouble at school, when I had fights with friends, when I was struggling with math. She always believed I was better than my worst moments. And now it's your turn to believe that about yourself, David said. You had a terrible moment, Maya. You said something unforgivable. But that doesn't make you an unforgivable person. How do you know? Because unforgivable people don't sit here crying about the pain they've caused. They don't ask how to make it right. They don't care about the damage they've done. Maya was quiet for a long moment, stacking her college papers with mechanical precision. I keep thinking about what she said. About how she'd been too afraid to ask herself the question I asked her. Rebecca frowned. What do you think she meant by that? I think she's been wondering if we'd all be better off without her. If her being here is too much of a burden. Maya's voice was barely audible. I think she's been feeling the same way I made her feel tonight, but she's been feeling it every day. The realization hit them all simultaneously. Eleanor hadn't just been hurt by Maya's words. She'd been confronted with the vocalization of her own deepest fears. Oh God, Rebecca whispered. She thinks she's a burden. She is a burden, Maya said quietly, then quickly added. But not the kind I made her feel like. She's a burden the way love is a burden. The way caring about someone is a burden. The way family is a burden. David nodded slowly. The kind of burden you carry willingly because the alternative is unthinkable. But I made her think we didn't want to carry it, Maya said, her voice breaking again. I made her think she was the wrong kind of burden. Rebecca stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. We all did, honey. We got so caught up in managing her care that we forgot to show her she was still wanted, not just needed. How do we fix that? Maya asked. I don't know, Rebecca admitted. But I think the first step is being honest about what we're all feeling. The fear, the grief, the frustration. Maybe if we can talk about it openly, we can find a way through it together. Maya finished stacking her papers and set them aside. I'm not sure I know how to do that. I'm not sure I know how to be honest without being cruel. You learn, David said simply. The same way you learned everything else. By practice, by making mistakes, by getting better over time. What if I make more mistakes? What if I say something else terrible? Rebecca turned back to her daughter. Then you'll apologize again, and again, and again, until you learn how to love someone without hurting them. Maya nodded, though she still looked uncertain. I should go check on her. Not yet, David said gently. Give her some time to process. Tomorrow, when she's ready to give you her answer, that's when you can start making this right. As if summoned by their conversation, they heard Eleanor's voice from the living room, not calling for help, but speaking softly to herself. It was something she did sometimes, a habit left over from her teaching days, when she would work through complex ideas out loud. Maya moved toward the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of her grandmother's voice. The others followed, and they found Eleanor sitting on the edge of her hospital bed, a worn leather journal in her lap. She looked up when she sensed their presence, her eyes still showing the pain of earlier but also something else, a kind of determined clarity. I've been thinking about your question, Maya, she said quietly. And I realize I've been thinking about it for months. Not the way you asked it, but the essence of it. Whether my continuing to live serves any purpose other than causing pain. Maya started to speak, but Eleanor raised her hand gently. Tomorrow, I'll give you my answer. But tonight, I want you to know that asking the question, even the way you asked it, wasn't entirely wrong. It was cruel, yes. It was hurtful. But it was also honest. And sometimes, painful honesty is the only way to reach the truth. She closed the journal and looked at each of them in turn. We've all been walking on eggshells around each other, trying to protect feelings that were already broken. Maybe it's time we stopped being so careful and started being real. With that, she lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, leaving her family to contemplate the weight of words, both spoken and unspoken, and the complicated mathematics of love, loss, and the courage it takes to keep choosing life, even when that choice breaks your heart. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through the quiet house. Eleanor lay propped against her pillows, the worn leather journal resting on her lap like a confessor, waiting to receive her secrets. Sleep had abandoned her hours ago, driven away by the weight of Maya's question, and the promise she'd made to provide an answer. The journal's pages were filled with letters she'd been writing since the stroke, messages to family members, friends, even former students. Letters meant to be read after I'm gone, as she'd come to think of her death. But tonight, one particular letter called to her, written months ago during a sleepless night not unlike this one. "My dearest Maya," it began. "If you're reading this, then the inevitable has finally happened, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's need to have the last word." Eleanor's fingers traced the carefully formed letters, remembering the pain in her right hand as she'd forced it to cooperate that night. The stroke had affected her fine motor skills, making the act of writing a laborious process, but she'd persisted. Some words, she'd learned, were worth the struggle. She'd written the letter during one of her darkest periods, about 3 months after moving in with Rebecca's family. The adjustment had been brutal, not just the physical limitations, but the psychological weight of dependence. Every morning had felt like a small defeat, every request for help a reminder of what she'd lost. "I know you've been watching me struggle," the letter continued, "and I suspect you've been wondering, as I have, whether this diminished version of myself is worth the trouble she causes. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about the most important question I was ever asked." Eleanor remembered that night with crystalline clarity. She'd been sitting in this same bed, listening to the sounds of the household settling into sleep. Rebecca's quiet movements as she prepared for another double shift, David's textbooks closing with soft thuds, Maya's music playing softly through her bedroom door. Normal sounds that had made Eleanor feel like an intruder in her own daughter's life. 2 doors down, Maya lay staring at her ceiling, her own sleep destroyed by the echo of her grandmother's words. "Thank you for asking the question I've been too afraid to ask myself." The phrase had been playing on repeat in her mind for hours, each repetition revealing new layers of meaning. She'd hurt her grandmother, that much was clear, but Eleanor's response suggested something more complex than simple injury. There had been recognition in her voice, even gratitude. As if Maya had given voice to something Eleanor had been carrying in silence. Maya rolled over and pulled her pillow over her head, trying to block out the memory of her grandmother's face in that moment. The brief flicker of pain followed by something that looked almost like relief. It was that relief that terrified Maya most. What if her cruel words had given Eleanor permission to give up? The thought sent Maya sitting upright in bed, her heart racing. She'd been so focused on her own guilt and shame that she hadn't considered the possibility that her question might have been dangerous in ways she hadn't intended. What if Eleanor took it as evidence that her family would be better off without her? Unable to bear the uncertainty, Maya slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. The house was old, and she'd learned which floorboards creaked during her years of midnight snack runs. She paused outside her grandmother's doorway, listening. The soft rustle of pages turning confirmed Eleanor was awake. Maya pressed her ear to the door, hearing the faint scratch of pen on paper. Her grandmother was writing something, another letter perhaps, or maybe her answer to Maya's question. The thought of that answer terrified Maya. She'd spoken in anger, in frustration, in the grip of emotions she couldn't control. But Eleanor would respond with the careful consideration of someone who'd spent a lifetime choosing words for their precise meaning. Whatever she said tomorrow would be final, definitive. Maya sank to the floor outside the door, her back against the hallway wall. Through the thin barrier, she could hear her grandmother's quiet breathing, the occasional sigh as she paused in her writing. These were the sounds of someone wrestling with profound questions, and Maya realized she was the cause of that struggle. Inside her room, Eleanor paused in her letter writing to listen. She'd heard the soft footsteps in the hallway, the subtle shift of weight against the door. Maya was there, just outside, probably torturing herself with guilt and fear. Eleanor's heart ached for her granddaughter, remembering her own 16-year-old self, and the way emotional pain had seemed to consume everything in its path. She set down her pen and closed the journal. Tomorrow's answer would come from the letter she'd written months ago, but tonight, she needed to think about the girl sitting in her hallway, afraid to knock, but unable to leave. Maya at 6, Eleanor remembered, curled up in my reading chair, insisting I read just one more chapter of Charlotte's Web. She'd been devastated by Charlotte's death, inconsolable at the idea that something so beautiful and important could simply end. I'd held her while she cried, explaining that death was part of life, that love continued even after someone was gone. She'd looked at me with such trust, such faith that I could explain away all the world's pain. Maya at 10, Eleanor continued her mental catalogue, struggling with long division, throwing her pencil across the room in frustration. "I'm too stupid for math," she'd declared. I'd sat beside her at the kitchen table, showing her how to break the problem into smaller pieces, how to find patterns in the numbers. When she finally understood, her face had lit up with such joy. "You make everything make sense, Gran," she'd said. Maya at 13, Eleanor remembered with a pang, dealing with her first real heartbreak when Jason Miller chose Sarah Chen for the school dance. She'd cried in my arms, convinced her world was ending. I'd made her tea and told her about my own first heartbreak, how devastating it had felt at the time, how insignificant it seemed now. She'd accused me of not understanding, of being too old to remember what real pain felt like. Even then, she'd been quick to wound when she was hurting. And now Maya at 16, asking the question that had been haunting Eleanor's own thoughts. "Why don't you just die already?" Eleanor understood now that Maya's question wasn't really about death. It was about fear. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of watching someone you love become something different than what they'd always been. It was the same fear that had driven Eleanor to write these letters, to plan for her own absence because she couldn't bear the thought of being a burden. She picked up her pen again and added a new paragraph to Maya's letter. "You asked me tonight why I don't just die, and I want you to know that I've asked myself the same question many times since my stroke. Not because I want to die, but because I love you all enough to wonder if my continued existence causes more pain than joy. It's a question that anyone who becomes dependent on others must eventually face. At what point does the burden outweigh the blessing?" The honesty of the words surprised Eleanor. She'd been so careful around her family, so determined to be grateful and uncomplaining, that she'd never admitted how often she'd wondered if they'd be better off without her. Maya's cruel question had simply vocalized the fear that lived in Eleanor's heart every day. But tonight, she continued writing, "I realized that the wrong question. The question isn't whether I should die, it's whether I should live. And living, truly living, requires more than just breathing. It requires purpose, connection, the ability to give, as well as receive. I've been so focused on what I've lost that I'd forgotten to look for what I might still have to offer." Outside the door, Maya had fallen asleep against the wall, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Eleanor could hear the soft, even breathing of exhausted youth. Tomorrow, when Maya woke with a stiff neck and the weight of her words still heavy on her conscience, Eleanor would give her the answer she'd requested, but not the answer Maya expected. Eleanor had spent her career teaching students that literature's greatest power lay in its ability to transform pain into understanding, to find meaning in suffering. Tonight, she would apply that lesson to her own life. Maya's question had been a gift, though neither of them had recognized it at the time. A gift that forced Eleanor to examine not just whether she wanted to keep living, but how she wanted to live. She finished the letter as the clock chimed 1 in the morning. "So here is my answer to your question, my darling girl. I don't want to die, I want to live. Not the diminished life I've been accepting, but a life that has meaning and purpose, despite its limitations. I want to stop apologizing for needing help, and start looking for ways to help others. I want to stop seeing my stroke as an ending and start seeing it as a beginning of something different but still valuable. I want to live because I love you, Maya. Because watching you grow into the remarkable woman you're becoming is worth every moment of struggle. Because your pain tonight showed me that you need me alive, not despite my limitations, but because of them. You need to see that survival is possible, that adaptation is possible, that love continues even when everything else changes. I want to live because I have stories to tell, wisdom to share, and love to give. My body may be weaker, my speech may be slower, my independence may be compromised, but my heart is still full of all the things that make life worth living. I want to live because the alternative, giving up, giving in, choosing death over difficulty, would teach you that love has limits, that people are only valuable when they're convenient. And that, my dear Maya, is a lesson I refuse to leave you with." Eleanor set down her pen and closed the journal. Tomorrow, She would read this letter to Maya, to the whole family. She would answer the question that had shattered their dinner table with the full weight of her experience, her wisdom, and her love. Outside her door, Maya stirred in her sleep, her dreams filled with fragments of memory, her grandmother's voice reading bedtime stories, her grandmother's hands helping with homework, her grandmother's arms offering comfort during the storms of growing up. In her dreams, Eleanor was whole again, unmarked by stroke or struggle. But when Maya woke, she would learn that wholeness had nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with the courage to keep loving, keep living, keep choosing hope over despair. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another hour in the long night of reckoning. Soon, dawn would come, and with it, the answer to a question that had changed everything simply by being asked. Morning light filtered through the living room curtains, casting long shadows across Eleanor's hospital bed as she sat propped against her pillows, the leather journal resting in her lap like a sacred text. She had been awake for hours, listening to the sounds of her family stirring: Rebecca's alarm clock, David's shower, Maya's hesitant footsteps in the hallway. Maya appeared in the doorway first, her hair disheveled from sleeping against the wall, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She stood there uncertainly, as if asking permission to enter her own home's living room. "Come in, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying none of the hurt from the night before. "I believe I owe you an answer." Maya's face crumpled slightly, but she forced herself to walk forward, perching on the edge of the couch like a bird ready to take flight. "Gran, I need to say something first. I need to—" "Later," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Right now, I need you to listen. Can you do that for me?" Maya nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold her emotions in check. Rebecca emerged from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, her nurse's uniform crisped despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. She'd barely slept, torn between comforting her daughter and processing her own feelings about the previous night's revelations. "Should I?" Rebecca began, but Eleanor shook her head. "Stay, please, all of you." Eleanor's gaze found David as he appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from the shower. "What happened last night involved all of us, not just Maya." David settled into the armchair while Rebecca took the opposite end of the couch from Maya, leaving a careful space between mother and daughter. The family arrangement looked formal, expectant, like an audience waiting for a performance. Eleanor opened the journal to the letter she'd been working on through the night, her fingers tracing the words she'd written months ago, during her own darkest period. The pages were slightly yellowed, edges worn from handling, testament to how often she'd returned to these thoughts. "Maya," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of her teaching days. "You asked me a question last night. A terrible, hurtful question, but also an honest one. You asked me why I don't just die already." Maya flinched as if struck, but Eleanor continued without pause. "I want you to know that I've asked myself the same question many times since my stroke. Not because I want to die, but because I love you all enough to wonder if my continued existence causes more pain than joy." Rebecca's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Eleanor pressed on. "It's a question that anyone who becomes dependent on others must eventually face. At what point does the burden outweigh the blessing? I've lain in this bed, listening to your mother's exhausted sighs, watching you struggle to find space for your homework around my medical equipment, seeing David translate my unclear words with such patient kindness. And I've wondered if you'd all be better off without me." "Mom, no," Rebecca whispered, but Eleanor held up her hand. "Let me finish. I wrote this letter to Maya 3 months ago, during one of my worst nights. I want to read it to you now because sometimes the most important truths can only be spoken when we're not looking directly at each other." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she began to read. "My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, then the inevitable has finally happened, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's need to have the last word. I know you've been watching me struggle, and I suspect you've been wondering, as I have, whether this diminished version of myself is worth the trouble she causes." Maya's sob was barely contained, but Eleanor continued reading. "Tonight, I want to tell you a story about the most important question I was ever asked. It wasn't in a classroom or a faculty meeting. It was in a hospital room 47 years ago when your grandfather was dying of cancer." Eleanor paused, her voice catching slightly. Even after all these years, the memory of Robert's final days could still take her breath away. He'd been fighting for 8 months, and the treatments were making him sicker than the disease. One afternoon, when the pain was particularly bad, he looked at me and asked, "Ellie, why are we doing this? Why don't we just let me go?" David leaned forward, drawn into the story despite himself. He'd heard fragments of his grandfather's death before, but never this intimate detail. "I was furious with him," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "How dare he ask me to give up? How dare he suggest that our love wasn't worth fighting for? But later, when I was alone, I realized he wasn't asking me to let him die. He was asking me to help him live, truly live, for whatever time he had left." Eleanor looked up from the journal, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "We stopped the treatments that were destroying his quality of life. We brought him home. We filled his last 3 months with music, with stories, with grandchildren who were too young to understand death but old enough to share their joy. He died in our bed, surrounded by love, having lived fully until his final breath." Rebecca was crying openly now, remembering her father's death through new eyes. She'd been only 22 then, barely older than David was now. "Your grandfather taught me that the question isn't whether we should live or die," Eleanor continued. "The question is how we choose to live. And I've been choosing poorly, Maya. I've been choosing to see myself as a burden rather than a blessing, to focus on what I've lost rather than what I still have to offer." Eleanor closed the journal and set it aside, her hands steadier than they'd been in months. "So here is my answer to your question, my darling girl. I don't want to die, I want to live. Not the diminished life I've been accepting, but a life that has meaning and purpose, despite its limitations." Maya's face was streaked with tears, but she remained silent, hanging on every word. "I want to stop apologizing for needing help, and start looking for ways to help others. I want to stop seeing my stroke as an ending and start seeing it as a beginning of something different, but still valuable." Eleanor's voice grew passionate, animated by an energy that had been absent for months. "I want to live because I love you, Maya. Because watching you grow into the remarkable woman you're becoming is worth every moment of struggle. Because your pain last night showed me that you need me alive, not despite my limitations, but because of them." "I don't understand," Maya whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "You need to see that survival is possible, that adaptation is possible, that love continues even when everything else changes. You're facing your own challenges now, college applications, the pressure to succeed, the fear of failure. How can I teach you to persevere if I don't persevere myself?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Maya's. "You asked me why I don't just die, and I'll tell you why. Because I have stories to tell, wisdom to share, and love to give. My body may be weaker, my speech may be slower, my independence may be compromised, but my heart is still full of all the things that make life worth living." David found himself nodding, recognizing the grandmother he'd always known beneath the physical changes the stroke had brought. "I want to live because the alternative, giving up, giving in, choosing death over difficulty, would teach you that love has limits, that people are only valuable when they're convenient. And that, my dear Maya, is a lesson I refuse to leave you with." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of crying and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor's words hung in the air like a benediction, transforming the space where so much pain had been spoken the night before. Maya finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Gran. I'm so sorry for what I said." "I know you are," Eleanor replied gently. "But, Maya, your question, as cruel as it was, forced me to examine my own assumptions about my life. You made me realize that I'd been choosing to see myself as a burden when I could choose to see myself as a gift." "But you are a burden," Maya said, then quickly continued, before anyone could react. "You're the kind of burden that makes us stronger. The kind that teaches us about love and sacrifice and what really matters." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in months. "Exactly. The kind of burden that's actually a blessing in disguise." Rebecca spoke for the first time since Eleanor had begun reading. "Mom, I need you to know that you're not a burden to me. You're my mother. Taking care of you isn't a duty, it's a privilege. Even when I'm scattered and emotional and snapping at everyone? Rebecca's voice was thick with tears. Especially then? Eleanor replied. Because that's when you need me most. When life is overwhelming and you don't know how to handle everything you're carrying. That's when having someone who's weathered their own storms can be most valuable. David cleared his throat. Gran, I need to tell you something. Helping you with your exercises, translating when your speech gets unclear, it's not just helping you. It's helping me understand what I want to do with my life. Working with you has shown me that medicine isn't just about curing diseases. It's about helping people maintain their dignity and find meaning even when their bodies fail them. Eleanor's eyes brightened. You're going to be a wonderful doctor, David. And part of that wisdom will come from watching your old grandmother refuse to give up. Maya looked around at her family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since the stroke. I've been so focused on what we lost that I couldn't see what we still have. What do we still have? Eleanor asked gently. Each other, Maya replied. We still have each other. And we still have love. And we still have time to figure out how to make this work. Eleanor nodded. That's exactly right. And Maya, I want you to know that your question last night, as painful as it was, may have saved my life. Not because I was planning to die, but because I was planning to stop living. There's a difference. I think I understand, Maya said slowly. You were going to keep breathing but stop trying to find joy. Yes. And now I want to try again. I want to find new ways to contribute, to matter, to be useful. I want to help you with your college applications, not by taking over, but by sharing what I've learned about resilience and perseverance. Maya's smile was watery, but genuine. I'd like that. I want to work with David on his medical studies, sharing what I've learned about the patient experience. I want to help your mother find ways to manage her stress without carrying guilt about needing help. Rebecca reached across the couch and took Maya's hand. We're going to figure this out together, all of us. Eleanor picked up the journal again, but this time, she turned to a fresh page. I've been writing letters to be read after I die. But I think it's time I started writing letters to be read while I'm alive. Letters about hope, about possibility, about the beautiful complexity of loving imperfect people in an imperfect world. She looked at Maya with eyes that sparkled with renewed purpose. Would you help me with that project? Maya nodded eagerly. Yes, I would love to help you with that. Then let's begin, Eleanor said, picking up her pen. Let's begin the next chapter of our story, together. The doorbell's chime cut through the morning stillness just as Eleanor was helping Maya organize her college application materials on the kitchen table, a symbolic reclaiming of the space that had been dominated by medical equipment. The simple act of spreading papers across the wooden surface felt revolutionary, a declaration that life was continuing, evolving, rather than merely surviving. That'll be Dr. Chen, Rebecca said, glancing at the clock. I forgot she was coming for your session today. Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness. Sarah Chen had been her physical therapist for 6 months, witnessing Eleanor's struggles and small victories with professional detachment balanced by genuine care. But today felt different. Today, Eleanor would have to face someone who knew her medical reality while carrying the weight of last night's revelation and this morning's transformation. Should I reschedule? Rebecca asked, sensing the shift in atmosphere. No, Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. I want her to meet the woman who's decided to live, not just survive. Maya looked up from her Northwestern University application essay, her eyes still puffy from crying but bright, with something that hadn't been there in months. Do you want me to move my stuff? Leave it, Eleanor said. Let her see that this house belongs to all of us, not just my medical needs. David answered the door, and Sarah Chen entered with her usual efficiency, her therapy bag in one hand and her assessment clipboard in the other. She was a small woman in her early 50s, with silver threading through her black hair, and the kind of steady presence that made patients feel both challenged and supported. Good morning, Eleanor, Sarah said, then paused, her trained eye catching something different in the room's energy. How are you feeling today? Different, Eleanor replied honestly. Very different. Sarah's gaze swept the kitchen, taking in Maya's college materials spread across the table where medical supplies usually lived, Rebecca's relaxed posture instead of her usual frantic efficiency, David's presence in the room rather than his typical retreat to avoid the therapy session. Different how? Sarah asked, setting down her bag and giving Eleanor her full attention. Eleanor looked around at her family, drawing strength from their faces. We had a family crisis last night, the kind that either destroys you or transforms you. We chose transformation. Sarah's expression shifted from professional assessment to genuine interest. In her 6 months of working with Eleanor, she'd watched the family struggle with the dynamics of caregiving, the strain of adjustment, the unspoken resentments that built up like sediment in a riverbed. Would you like to tell me about it? Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from Eleanor. My granddaughter asked me why I don't just die already, Eleanor said matter-of-factly, watching Sarah's face for reaction. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained neutral. That must have been painful to hear. It was the most honest thing anyone has said to me since my stroke, Eleanor replied. And it saved my life. Sarah leaned forward slightly. How so? Maya spoke up, her voice tentative but growing stronger. I said something terrible, because I was scared and angry and I didn't know how to handle watching my grandmother change. But, Gran? She turned it into something beautiful. Beautiful might be overstating it, Eleanor said with a small smile, but necessary. Maya forced me to examine whether I was choosing to live or just choosing not to die. There's a difference. Sarah nodded slowly. There is indeed. In my work, I see many patients who are existing rather than living. What changed for you? Eleanor's hand moved to touch the journal beside her. I realized that I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I'd forgotten to look for what I still had to offer. I'd been apologizing for needing help instead of looking for ways to help others. And now? Now I want to try again. I want to find meaning in this new version of my life. Sarah's expression softened. Eleanor, in 6 months of working with you, I've seen you make remarkable physical progress, but I've also seen you withdraw emotionally. Today, you seem present in a way you haven't been before. I am present, Eleanor said. For the first time since my stroke, I'm fully present. Sarah glanced around the room again, this time taking in the subtle changes in family dynamics. How has this affected the rest of you? Rebecca spoke first. I've been carrying so much guilt about resenting the situation sometimes, about being tired and overwhelmed, and not always being patient. But Mom helped me realize that those feelings are normal, and that caring for someone doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your own emotional needs. And you, David? Sarah asked. David shifted slightly, his medical student's mind working through the psychological implications of what had happened. I've been trying to fix everything, to be the perfect caregiver, the perfect grandson. But I learned that sometimes people don't need to be fixed. Sometimes they just need to be seen and heard. Sarah turned to Maya, who was fidgeting with her essay papers. Maya, it must have taken tremendous courage to speak honestly about your feelings, even if it came out in a hurtful way. Maya's face crumpled slightly. I said something unforgivable. Did you? Sarah asked gently. Or did you say something that felt unforgivable but turned out to be necessary? I don't know, Maya whispered. I just know that I was so scared of losing my grandmother that I pushed her away. And I was so angry about how everything changed that I blamed her for things she couldn't control. Sarah nodded. Those are very common reactions to watching someone you love face health challenges. The fear of loss often makes us act in ways that create the very distance we're trying to avoid. But Gran showed me that I don't have to be afraid of loving someone who's struggling, Maya said, looking at Eleanor with eyes full of admiration. She showed me that people can be strong and vulnerable at the same time. Sarah looked at Eleanor with something approaching awe. How did you manage to transform such a painful moment into a teaching opportunity? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I think it goes back to my years in the classroom. I learned that the most important learning happens when students are forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Maya forced me to confront the truth about how I'd been living, or not living. And what truth was that? That I'd been choosing to see myself as a burden rather than a blessing. That I'd been waiting for permission to matter again instead of creating my own meaning. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Eleanor, I have to tell you something. I lost my own grandmother 6 months ago, just before I started working with you. She was 84, fiercely independent, and when she started needing help, she hated it. She saw it as failure instead of just life. Eleanor felt a connection spark. What happened to her? She withdrew, stopped engaging with the family, stopped doing the things that brought her joy. She was alive, but she wasn't living. When she died, I felt like I'd lost her twice. Once when she stopped being herself, and again when she actually died. The room fell silent as everyone processed this revelation. Is that why you became a physical therapist? David asked. Partly, Sarah admitted. I wanted to help people maintain their dignity and find purpose, even when their bodies were failing them. But I have to be honest. I was losing hope that it was possible until I met your family. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. I mean that watching your struggles over the past 6 months has shown me both the dangers of giving up and the possibility of transformation. Eleanor, you've been teaching me as much as I've been helping you. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I had no idea. That's the thing about being a teacher, Sarah said with a gentle smile. You don't always know when you're doing it. But Eleanor, what you've accomplished in this room this morning, helping your family process pain and find meaning, that's profound therapeutic work. Maya looked up from her essay. Dr. Chen, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you help people when they're so scared of losing someone that they push them away? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think you have to help them understand that love isn't diminished by struggle. It's deepened by it. When you care for someone through their difficulties, when you choose to stay present during their pain, you're participating in the most sacred kind of love. But it's so hard, Maya said. Watching someone you love change. Yes, it is. But Maya, think about it this way. Your grandmother is still your grandmother. She's still the person who taught you to read, who listened to your problems, who believed in you. The stroke didn't change her heart or her mind or her love for you. It just changed the package it comes in. Eleanor reached across the table and took Maya's hand. And maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe struggling together has taught us things about love that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. Maya squeezed her grandmother's hand. Like what? Like the fact that love isn't about being perfect or easy to care for. It's about being present, being honest, being willing to grow together even when it's difficult. Sarah watched the interaction with professional interest. Eleanor, I'd like to propose something. What if we shifted your therapy focus from just physical recovery to helping you develop new ways to contribute to your family and community? Eleanor's eyes brightened. What did you have in mind? Well, you're a retired literature professor. Maya's working on college essays. David's studying medicine and could benefit from understanding the patient experience. Rebecca's a nurse who's dealing with caregiver stress. What if we designed exercises that addressed your physical needs while also letting you share your expertise? You mean like helping Maya with her writing while doing hand exercises? Eleanor asked. Exactly. Or discussing medical ethics with David while working on your speech clarity. Or sharing stress management techniques with Rebecca while doing your balance exercises. Maya's face lit up. That would be amazing. I could really use help with my essays. And I'd love to understand more about what patients experience during recovery, David added. Rebecca nodded. I've been so focused on the medical aspects of caring for Mom that I haven't been thinking about how to help her maintain her identity as a teacher and mentor. Sarah smiled. This is exactly what I mean. Eleanor, you've been thinking of yourself as someone who needs to be cared for, But you're also someone who has wisdom to share, experience to offer, knowledge to pass on. Your stroke didn't erase any of that. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. A lightening, an opening, a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced in months. You're suggesting that I can be both a patient and a teacher. I'm suggesting that you never stopped being a teacher. You just forgot for a while. Maya looked at her grandmother with new eyes. Gran, would you really help me with my college essays? I would love to, Eleanor said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. But not just to help you get into college, to help you learn to write about your experiences in a way that honors their complexity. What do you mean? I mean that your essay about last night, about asking me why I don't just die, and learning that love means staying present even when it's difficult, that could be a powerful piece of writing. Not because it's shocking, but because it's honest. Maya's eyes widened. You think I should write about what happened? I think you should write about what you learned, about how fear can make us cruel, but love can make us brave, about how families can be broken and healed by the same words. Sarah watched the exchange with growing excitement. Eleanor, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not just helping Maya with her writing, you're helping her understand her experience in a deeper way. And you're not just doing physical therapy, David added. You're showing us how to find meaning in difficulty. Eleanor looked around the table at her family, seeing them clearly for the first time in months. I spent so much time mourning the teacher I used to be that I couldn't see the teacher I could still become. And what kind of teacher is that? Rebecca asked. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. The kind who teaches by example, the kind who shows that wisdom comes not from avoiding hardship, but from finding purpose within it. Sarah began packing up her equipment, but instead of the usual clinical notes, she was making different kinds of observations. Eleanor, I think we're going to have very different kinds of therapy sessions from now on. Good, Eleanor said. I'm ready to be a student again. And a teacher. And a grandmother who's fully present for whatever comes next. As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Eleanor, I want you to know that what happened here today, the way you've transformed crisis into connection, that's going to stay with me. You've reminded me why I chose this profession. After Sarah left, the family sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the morning's revelations. The house felt different somehow, lighter, more spacious, filled with possibility rather than limitation. So, Maya said finally, looking down at her college application essay, want to help me figure out how to write about the most difficult night of my life? Eleanor reached for her reading glasses. I thought you'd never ask. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting golden rectangles across the table where Maya's college essay draft lay between her and Eleanor. 3 hours had passed since Dr. Chen's departure, and the pages before them bore the evidence of their collaboration. Maya's neat handwriting interspersed with Eleanor's more labored script, corrections and suggestions flowing between grandmother and granddaughter like a conversation made visible. Maya's initial attempt had been clinical, sanitized. Family challenges can teach us about resilience and the importance of communication. Eleanor had gently crossed out the entire paragraph with a single stroke of her pen. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear, Eleanor had said. Tell me what you learned from asking me why I don't just die. Now, 3 drafts later, Maya was writing with the kind of raw honesty that made Eleanor's heart ache with pride. I asked my grandmother why she didn't just die, and in that moment, I became someone I didn't recognize. The words came from a place of fear so deep I hadn't known it existed. Fear of losing her, fear of watching her suffer, fear of loving someone whose future was uncertain. But her response taught me that cruelty born of fear is still cruelty, and that love requires staying present even when presence hurts. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her left hand steadier than it had been in months as she reached for her coffee. Better. Much better. But I want you to go deeper. What did you learn about yourself in that moment? Maya stared at the page, her pen hovering over the paper. I learned that I'm capable of being cruel to the people I love most. And that I'm more like Dad than I wanted to admit. The words hung between them like a bridge finally built across a chasm. Eleanor had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come eventually. Maya's father had been a master of emotional warfare, using love as a weapon and words as ammunition. The divorce had been inevitable, but its scars ran deeper than Rebecca liked to acknowledge. "How are you like your father?" Eleanor asked gently. Maya's hand trembled slightly. "When I'm hurt or scared, I lash out. I find the thing that will hurt most and I say it. Just like he did to Mom." "And how are you different from your father?" The question surprised Maya. She'd been so focused on the similarities that she hadn't considered the differences. I don't know. Think about what happened after you said those words to me." Maya's brow furrowed as she considered. "I felt horrible. I wanted to take it back immediately." "Your father never felt horrible about the things he said. He felt justified. He felt righteous. He felt like his pain gave him permission to cause pain." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Maya could hear the years of accumulated wisdom in her words. "You felt horrible because you have empathy. You felt horrible because you recognized that your pain didn't give you the right to inflict pain." "But I still said it." "Yes, you did, and that's part of being human. We all have the capacity for cruelty, Maya. The question is what we do with that capacity." Maya looked down at her essay, seeing her own words with new eyes. "I'm writing about this for my college application. What if they think I'm a terrible person? What if they think you're a person who's learned something important about love and forgiveness? What if they think you're someone who's grappled with real moral complexity and come out stronger?" The front door opened, and David's voice carried into the kitchen. "I'm home. How's the writing going?" "Come see for yourself," Eleanor called back. David appeared in the doorway, his backpack slung over his shoulder and a curious expression on his face. "Maya actually let you help her with her essay?" "She didn't let me help," Eleanor corrected with a smile. "She let me teach." David moved closer to read over Maya's shoulder. After a moment, he whistled softly. "Maya, this is really good. Really honest." "You think so?" Maya's voice held a note of uncertainty. "I think anyone who reads this will understand that you've learned something important about what it means to be human, about what it means to love someone imperfectly." Eleanor watched David's face as he read, seeing the medical student's analytical mind working alongside his brother's protective instincts. "What do you think, David, as someone who's going to be caring for patients and families facing similar challenges?" David was quiet for a long moment, his finger tracing one of Maya's sentences. "I think you're both teaching me something I can't learn from textbooks. About how fear can make people say things they don't mean, and how healing happens when we choose to see the fear underneath the cruelty. And what does that mean for you as a future doctor?" "It means I need to remember that the family members I'll be working with are dealing with their own grief and fear. That sometimes when they're difficult or demanding or even cruel, it's because they're drowning in emotions they don't know how to handle." Maya looked up at her brother with new respect. "You're going to be a really good doctor, David." Quote, "I hope so, but I'm learning that being a good doctor isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about understanding the whole person, the whole family." The sound of keys in the front door announced Rebecca's return from her shortened shift. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her scrubs but looking less exhausted than she had in months. "How did the writing session go?" she asked, kissing Eleanor's forehead and ruffling Maya's hair. "Read it," Maya said, pushing the essay toward her mother. Rebecca settled into the chair beside Eleanor, her nursing badge catching the afternoon light. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to recognition, to something approaching awe. "Maya, this is beautiful, and brave, and so honest it takes my breath away. You think it's too much? Too personal? I think it's exactly what a college admissions officer needs to read. Not another essay about overcoming adversity or learning responsibility, but a real examination of what it means to be human, to fail, to learn, to grow." Eleanor felt a swell of pride as she watched her daughter and granddaughter connect over the work they'd done together. "Rebecca," Maya was worried that writing about our family crisis would make her look bad. Oh, sweetheart, Rebecca said, reaching for Maya's hand. This essay makes you look real. It makes you look like someone who's capable of growth, of self-reflection, of learning from mistakes. Those are exactly the kinds of qualities good schools want to see. Maya's shoulders relaxed slightly. I was so scared that admissions officers would think I was awful for saying what I said to Gran. What you said was awful, Rebecca replied honestly. But what you learned from it, what you did with that awfulness, that's what matters. That's what makes you human rather than perfect. David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through something. Actually, Maya, I want to show you something. I've been researching medical ethics for one of my classes, and I came across this quote from a physician who wrote about family dynamics during medical crises. He cleared his throat and began reading. The most hurtful words often come from the most loving hearts. When we see someone we love suffering, our own pain can manifest as anger, frustration, even cruelty. The mark of emotional maturity is not the absence of these feelings, but the ability to recognize them, take responsibility for them, and choose to act differently in the future. Maya's eyes widened. That's exactly what I was trying to say in my essay. Because it's what you experienced, Eleanor said. You discovered that love and cruelty can coexist, and that the choice to act on love rather than cruelty is what defines our character. Rebecca looked at the essay again, this time with her professional perspective. Maya, I see families in crisis every day at the hospital. I see how fear and exhaustion and grief can make people say terrible things to each other. But I also see how healing happens when people choose to see past the words to the pain underneath. Is that what you did with Dad? Maya asked quietly. See past his words to his pain? The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with years of unspoken complexity. I tried to, Rebecca replied carefully. But your father didn't want to acknowledge his pain. He wanted to use it as an excuse for causing pain. There's a difference. And that's what I'm learning, Maya said, her voice growing stronger. That having pain doesn't give you the right to inflict pain. That you can acknowledge your fear and hurt without using it as a weapon. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed Maya's hand. And that's exactly what makes you different from your father. You're choosing to learn from your mistakes rather than justify them. David looked up from his phone. Maya, I want to ask you something. Are you planning to send this essay to Northwestern? Maya's face fell slightly. They already rejected me, remember? For early admission. But they have regular decision too. And Maya, this essay, combined with your grades and your interview performance, I think you might have a real chance. You think so? I think this essay shows exactly the kind of person they want in their student body. Someone who's capable of deep reflection, of learning from failure, of growing from difficult experiences. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the same feeling she'd had when a particularly promising student would make a breakthrough in understanding. Maya, I think David's right. But more importantly, I think you should send this essay because it represents who you're becoming, not just who you've been. Maya looked around the table at her family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since Eleanor's stroke. You know what? I don't care if Northwestern accepts me or not. I care that I've learned something important about myself and about love and about what it means to be part of a family. And that, Eleanor said with a smile, is exactly the kind of wisdom that great essays are made of. Rebecca stood and moved to the window, looking out at the late afternoon sky. I keep thinking about last night, about how close we came to losing each other, not physically but emotionally. How we almost let fear and frustration drive us apart. But we didn't, David said firmly. We chose to stay. We chose to work through it. We chose to love each other even when it was difficult, Maya added. Eleanor looked around at her family, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they'd taken together. You know what I think? I think we've all learned something important about the weight of words, about how they can wound or heal, divide or unite, depending on how we choose to use them. And we've learned that love is a choice, Rebecca said. A choice we make every day, especially when it's hard. Maya picked up her pen and added one final sentence to her essay. I asked my grandmother why she didn't just die, and she taught me how to live. Perfect, Eleanor said, her voice filled with pride. Absolutely perfect. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, as it had every Thursday for the past 30 years. Eleanor smiled from her position at the kitchen table, where she'd been reviewing Maya's final essay draft one last time. Some things, she reflected, were beautifully predictable, and Margaret Torres was one of them. "That'll be Maggie," Eleanor called to Rebecca, who was folding laundry in the living room. Right on time, as always. David opened the door to reveal a compact woman in her mid-70s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that sparkled with mischief. Margaret Torres had been Eleanor's closest friend since they'd met at a faculty wives' lunch in 1994, and she'd maintained her weekly visits even after Eleanor's stroke, with the devotion of someone who understood that friendship was not a fair-weather arrangement. "Where's my favorite patient?" Maggie called out, striding into the house with the confidence of someone who'd been part of the family for decades. "In the kitchen, and I'm not a patient today," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying more energy than Maggie had heard in months. Maggie paused in the doorway, her keen social worker's eyes taking in the scene before her. Eleanor sat upright at the table, her color good, her posture alert. Maya's college materials were spread between them, but instead of the medical equipment that usually dominated the space, there were books, papers, and the comfortable detritus of intellectual work. "Well, well," Maggie said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor. "Someone looks like she's rejoined the land of the living." "That's exactly what happened," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. Though it took a rather dramatic catalyst. Maggie's eyebrows rose. "Oh? Do tell." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Maya, who had been dreading this moment. Maggie Torres was legendary for her direct questions and her ability to cut through social niceties to reach the heart of matters. There would be no sanitized version of events. "Maya asked me why I don't just die already," Eleanor said simply. Maggie's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of shock or disapproval, she leaned back in her chair and let out a bark of laughter. "Did she now? And what did you tell her?" Maya's face flushed red. "Mrs. Torres, I didn't mean—" "Oh, honey," Maggie interrupted, her voice warm despite her directness. "I've been wondering the same thing for months. Not because I want Eleanor to die, but because I've been watching her disappear piece by piece, and I was starting to think she'd forgotten how to live." Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of recognition. This was why she'd treasured Maggie's friendship for so long, her ability to see truth clearly and speak it without apology. "You were watching me disappear?" Eleanor asked. "Absolutely. Every week I'd come here and find you a little more withdrawn, a little more apologetic for existing, a little more convinced that you were nothing but a burden." It was heartbreaking. Maya looked up from her essay, curiosity overriding her embarrassment. "What was she like before? Before the stroke?" Maggie's face lit up. "Your grandmother was a force of nature. She could command a room full of academics with a raised eyebrow. She could make the most difficult concepts seem simple, and she could spot potential in students that others had given up on." "She still can," David said, entering the kitchen with a medical textbook under his arm. "She's been helping me understand the psychological aspects of patient care in ways my professors never could." Maggie turned to look at David with interest. "How so?" "She's helping me understand that medical treatment isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about helping people maintain their sense of self, even when their bodies are failing them. And she's been teaching me to write with honesty instead of just trying to impress people," Maya added. Maggie nodded approvingly. "Now that sounds like the Eleanor I know. The one who never met a student she couldn't help, never encountered a problem she couldn't break down into manageable pieces." Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "Maggie, I need to ask you something. Was I really disappearing, or was I just different?" Maggie's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, do you remember what you told me when Robert was sick? When he was getting frustrated with his limitations and taking it out on everyone around him?" Eleanor thought back to those difficult months before her husband's death. I remember telling you that illness brings out both the best and worst in people. That it strips away pretense and reveals who we really are underneath. And what did you say about Robert specifically? I said that his illness was making him forget who he was. That he was so focused on what he couldn't do that he'd stopped doing what he could do. Maggie nodded. And that's exactly what I've been watching happen to you. You became so focused on your limitations that you forgot about your gifts. Maya looked between the two women, fascinated by this glimpse into her grandmother's past. What gifts? The ability to see potential in people when they can't see it in themselves, Maggie said. The ability to ask questions that make people think differently about their problems. The ability to turn even the most difficult experiences into learning opportunities. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I thought those gifts were gone. I thought the stroke had taken them away. The stroke took your mobility and affected your speech, Maggie replied firmly. It didn't touch your mind or your heart or your decades of accumulated wisdom. Those things were still there. You just forgot how to access them. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of conversation. Maggie, I'm so glad you're here. I feel like we've been drowning, and I wasn't sure how to help Mom find her way back to herself. Honey, you've been doing exactly what you should be doing. Keeping her safe, helping her heal, making sure she knew she was loved. But Eleanor needed to remember that being loved and being useful aren't mutually exclusive. That's what I've been learning, Eleanor said. I can be someone who needs help and someone who has help to offer. Maggie turned to Maya with a directness that made the teenager straighten in her chair. Maya, I want you to know that what you did, asking that terrible, necessary question, that took courage. Not the kind of courage that makes you feel good about yourself, but the kind that forces everyone to confront truth. Quote, I didn't feel courageous, Maya said quietly. I felt cruel. Good. If you'd felt courageous, it would have meant you didn't understand the weight of what you were saying. The fact that you felt cruel means you have empathy, which is exactly what this family needed. David looked up from his textbook. Mrs. Torres, can I ask you something? As someone who's worked with families in crisis, what do you think happens when people don't have conversations like this? Maggie's expression grew solemn. They drift apart. The sick person withdraws because they feel like a burden. The family members build up resentment because they're carrying stress they can't acknowledge. Everyone walks on eggshells, and nobody says what they're really thinking or feeling. And then what? Then the sick person dies feeling unloved and useless, and the family members live with guilt and regret. They lose each other twice, once to the illness, and once to all the things they never said. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. That's exactly what was happening to us. Until Maya broke the pattern, Maggie said. She said the unsayable thing, and instead of destroying the family, it gave everyone permission to be honest about their feelings. Maya looked down at her essay, seeing her experience through new eyes. I've been so focused on how horrible I was that I didn't think about how it might have been necessary. Necessary and horrible aren't mutually exclusive, Maggie replied. Sometimes the most important things we do are also the most difficult. Rebecca moved to stand behind Eleanor's chair, her hands resting on her mother's shoulders. Maggie, I have to admit something. I've been feeling so guilty about sometimes resenting the situation. About being tired and overwhelmed and not always patient. And now I'm learning that those feelings are normal. That caring for someone doesn't mean you have to be perfect or selfless all the time. Maggie nodded approvingly. Rebecca, you're a nurse. You know that caregiver burnout is real. You know that you can't pour from an empty cup. But somehow, when it's your own family, you forget that knowledge. I did forget. I thought that loving Mom meant never feeling burdened by her needs. Love means feeling burdened sometimes and choosing to carry the burden anyway, Maggie said. It means being honest about the difficulty while still choosing to stay. Eleanor reached up to squeeze Rebecca's hand. I needed to hear that my care was difficult for you, not because I wanted to feel guilty, but because I needed to know that my impact on your life was real and acknowledged. What do you mean? Maya asked. I mean that being pretend easy to care for made me feel invisible. Like I was just an object to be managed, rather than a person whose needs mattered enough to be genuinely challenging. David closed his textbook, fully engaged in the conversation. So acknowledging the burden actually made you feel more valued? Exactly. When Maya asked me why I don't just die, she was acknowledging that my presence has weight, that my existence matters enough to create real impact, even if that impact is sometimes difficult. Maggie leaned forward, her social worker instincts fully engaged. Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Before Maya asked that question, were you thinking about dying? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Not actively, but I was thinking about giving up, about withdrawing further, about becoming smaller and smaller until I was barely there at all. And now? Now I'm thinking about how to live fully within my limitations, how to contribute despite my challenges, how to be present instead of just existing. Maggie smiled, and for the first time in months, Eleanor saw real satisfaction in her friend's eyes. There's the Eleanor I know, the one who never met a challenge she couldn't reframe as an opportunity. Maya looked up from her essay, her face thoughtful. Mrs. Torres, do you think what happened to our family is unusual? Do other families go through crisis like this? Oh, honey, every family goes through crisis. The difference is whether they choose to grow from it or let it break them apart. How do you know which choice you're making? Maggie glanced around the kitchen, taking in the comfortable chaos of family life resuming. You're sitting here, talking honestly about difficult things, supporting each other through pain and finding ways to be useful to one another. That's how you know you're choosing growth. Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude as she looked around at her family and her oldest friend. Maggie, I realize I've been so focused on being independent that I forgot there's a difference between independence and isolation. What's the difference? Independence means doing things yourself when you can. Isolation means refusing help when you need it. I was choosing isolation and calling it independence. And now I'm choosing interdependence. I'm choosing to be part of a family where everyone gives and receives support according to their abilities and needs. Maya suddenly looked up, her eyes bright with understanding. That's what I want to write about in my essay. Not just the crisis, but the choice to stay connected through difficulty. Yes, Eleanor said, her voice filled with pride. Write about choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, growth over stagnation. Maggie stood and moved to the window, looking out at the late afternoon sky. Eleanor, I have to tell you something. I've been visiting you every week for months, and I've been watching you fade away. Today is the first time I've seen you fully present since your stroke. What changed? You remembered that you matter, not just as someone to be cared for, but as someone who has care to give. You remembered that your voice has value, that your experience has worth, that your presence makes a difference. Eleanor felt tears running down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of homecoming, of finally remembering who she was. Maggie, I want you to know that your friendship has been an anchor for me. Even when I couldn't see it, you kept showing up, kept believing that I was still in here somewhere. That's what friends do, Maggie replied simply. They hold space for you until you're ready to occupy it again. Maya looked between the two women, seeing a model of friendship that had endured through decades of change and challenge. I want to have friendships like that. You will, Maggie said, but first you have to learn to be a friend to yourself. You have to learn to hold space for your own growth, your own mistakes, your own journey toward becoming who you're meant to be. As the afternoon sun slanted lower through the kitchen windows, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her family to this moment. Crisis had become catalyst, pain had become wisdom, and love had proven stronger than fear. Thank you, Maggie, Eleanor said, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you, Eleanor, Maggie replied, for remembering how to be seen. 3 weeks had passed since the night Maya asked her devastating question, and the Patterson household had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just a month earlier. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her laptop open before her, while Maya worked on her tablet beside her, their heads bent together over what had become their daily collaboration. "The Northwestern essay is ready," Maya announced, her voice carrying a confidence that had been absent for months. "But I want to read the conclusion one more time." Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses, her movements more fluid than they'd been since the stroke. The tremor in her left hand had diminished significantly, though whether from physical improvement or renewed purpose, she couldn't say. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Maya's voice grew stronger as she read. "I learned that the most important questions aren't the ones we're comfortable asking. They're the ones that force us to examine our assumptions about love, loss, and what it means to be human. I asked my grandmother why she didn't just die, and she taught me how to live, not just survive, but live with intention, with courage, and with the understanding that we're all more resilient than we know." "Perfect," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with pride. "That's exactly the kind of wisdom admissions officers need to hear." David emerged from the living room, his medical textbook under his arm and a stack of printed pages in his hand. "Gran, I finished the paper you helped me with, the one about patient dignity and family dynamics. My ethics professor wants to submit it to the undergraduate research journal." Eleanor's face lit up with the kind of joy she hadn't experienced since her teaching days. "Really? He thinks it's publication quality?" He said it was the most insightful analysis of family grief responses he'd read from an undergraduate. He particularly loved the section about how caregivers need permission to acknowledge their own struggles. "That section came from watching your mother," Eleanor said, glancing toward the kitchen where Rebecca was preparing for her shift. "She taught me that loving someone doesn't mean pretending their care is effortless." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her scrubs freshly pressed and her expression more rested than it had been in months. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by a vitality that came from feeling useful rather than just used. "What are you all plotting in here?" Rebecca asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot Eleanor had managed to make herself that morning, a small victory that had become part of their new routine. "David's paper is getting published," Maya announced proudly. "The one Gran helped him write about family dynamics in medical settings." Rebecca's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's wonderful. I've been telling my colleagues about some of the insights you two have been sharing. The way you've reframed caregiver stress as a normal part of loving someone through difficulty. It's changing how I approach my own patients' families." Eleanor felt a warm flush of satisfaction. This was what she'd been missing. The sense that her knowledge and experience could still make a difference in the world. How so? "Yesterday, I had a patient's daughter who was crying because she'd snapped at her father during physical therapy. Instead of just telling her it was okay, I shared what you taught me about how anger and love can coexist. How sometimes we're cruelest to the people we're most afraid of losing. And she broke down and admitted she'd been terrified that her father was giving up. That her anger was really fear dressed up as frustration. It completely changed how she approached his care." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of purpose that had been absent for months. "This is what I've been missing. The ability to help people process difficult experiences and find meaning in them." Maya looked up from her tablet, where she'd been making final adjustments to her essay. "Gran, I've been thinking about what you said about being a different kind of teacher now. I want to help you start that project you mentioned, the letters about hope instead of just the after I'm gone letters. You want to help me write about living instead of dying? I want to help you share what you've learned about finding purpose in difficulty, about choosing growth over surrender, about love that stays present even when presence is hard." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I would love that, Maya. More than you know." David set down his textbook and moved closer to the table. "Actually, I have an idea about that. What if we turned it into a real project? Not just letters, but maybe a blog or a series of essays that other families could read?" You mean like a resource for people going through similar struggles? Rebecca asked, her nurse's mind immediately grasping the potential. Exactly. Gran has 40 years of teaching experience, plus her own journey through recovery. Maya has the perspective of a young person watching a grandparent face health challenges. You have the medical knowledge and the caregiver experience. I have the research background and the understanding of how families navigate medical crises. Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when a new curriculum idea would take shape. You're talking about combining our different perspectives into something that could help other families? I'm talking about turning our crisis into a resource, about using what we've learned to help other people feel less alone in their struggles. Maya's eyes were bright with enthusiasm. We could write about the things nobody talks about, like how it feels to watch someone you love change, how to be angry and grateful at the same time, how to ask for help without feeling like you're failing, how to love someone through their worst moments, Rebecca added. How to be present for difficulty without being consumed by it. Eleanor looked around the table at her family, seeing them with new eyes. A month ago, they'd been struggling to coexist in the same space. Now they were collaborating on something that could help others navigate similar challenges. I think it's a beautiful idea, Eleanor said, but I want to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. Not to make ourselves feel better about what we went through, but to genuinely help others. What would the right reasons look like? David asked. Eleanor thought for a moment, her teacher's mind working through the complexities. We'd need to be honest about the fact that we don't have all the answers, that we're still learning, still growing, that what worked for us might not work for everyone. But we could share what we've learned about asking the hard questions, Maya said. About how sometimes the most painful conversations are the ones that lead to the most growth. And we could write about the difference between fixing and supporting, Rebecca added. How families can help each other without trying to solve everything. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of excitement, the same feeling she'd experienced when she'd first started teaching, when she'd realized that education wasn't just about imparting knowledge, but about facilitating growth. You know what I love most about this idea? Eleanor said. It assumes that our experience has value, that our struggle has meaning, that our pain can be transformed into purpose. Isn't that what you've been teaching us all along? Maya asked. That difficult experiences become valuable when we learn from them and share that learning with others? Eleanor smiled, recognizing her own teaching philosophy reflected back to her. Yes, but I'd forgotten that lesson applied to my own life. I'd been so focused on what the stroke had taken from me that I couldn't see what it might have given me. What has it given you? David asked. Empathy for people facing limitations. Understanding of what it feels like to be dependent on others. Appreciation for the small victories. And most importantly, the knowledge that love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. Rebecca moved to stand behind Eleanor's chair, her hands resting on her mother's shoulders. Mom, I think this project could be incredible. Not just for the people who read it, but for us. It gives us a way to keep growing from what we've been through. And it honors what we've learned, Maya added. It says that our crisis mattered, that our healing mattered, that our love mattered. Eleanor reached up to squeeze Rebecca's hand. Then let's do it. Let's create something that helps other families understand that crisis can become catalyst, that pain can become wisdom, and that love can survive even the most difficult questions. David pulled out his phone and began typing notes. I'll start researching platforms for sharing content. Maybe we can start with a simple blog and see how it develops. I'll work on the first essay, Maya said. About what it feels like to ask someone you love a question you can't take back. And I'll write about the medical perspective, Rebecca added. About how families can support each other through health crises without losing themselves. Eleanor felt a deep sense of anticipation as she looked around the table at her family. And I'll write about what I've learned about finding purpose in limitation. About choosing to live fully, even when life looks different than you planned. As they continued planning their project, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, they'd been a family in crisis, struggling to navigate the changed landscape of their lives. Now they were a family with a mission, united by their shared experience and their desire to help others. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 o'clock, marking not just the passage of time but the beginning of something new. Eleanor looked at her laptop screen, her fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to write the first words of what would become their collaborative testament to the power of love, the necessity of difficult conversations, and the possibility of transformation even in the darkest moments. "What should we call it?" Maya asked. "The project, I mean." Eleanor considered the question, thinking about all they'd learned and all they hoped to share. How about the weight of words? Because words can wound or heal, divide or unite, depending on how we choose to use them. "Perfect," David said, typing the title into his phone. "The Weight of Words, A Family's Journey Through Crisis to Connection." As Eleanor began typing the first sentence of their collaborative story, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. Maya's cruel question had shattered their carefully maintained politeness. But from those shattered pieces, they'd built something stronger. A family that could face truth together. A love that could survive even the most difficult words. And a purpose that transformed their pain into possibility. The weight of words, Eleanor thought as she wrote, was not just in their power to hurt, but in their power to heal. And sometimes, the most healing words were the ones that were hardest to speak. 6 months later, the Patterson house buzzed with the particular energy that comes from meaningful work being done. Eleanor sat at her desk, a real desk now, positioned by the living room window where she could watch the seasons change, reviewing the latest batch of emails from families who had found their blog, The Weight of Words. The hospital bed was gone, replaced by a comfortable reading chair and a small bookshelf filled with the notebooks from their collaborative project. "Gran, you need to see this," Maya called from the kitchen table, where she was managing the blog's social media presence while working on her senior year coursework. "We got a message from a woman in Portland whose mother just had a stroke. She said our post about the questions we're afraid to ask made her cry but also made her feel less alone." Eleanor's heart swelled with the familiar satisfaction of meaningful work. "Read it to me." Maya's voice grew gentle as she read, "Dear Patterson family, I found your blog after spending 3 weeks tiptoeing around my mother's stroke recovery, pretending everything was fine while dying inside. Your honesty about the ugly thoughts that come with caregiving made me realize I'm not a terrible person for feeling overwhelmed. For the first time since Mom came home from the hospital, I was able to tell her that I love her but I'm scared, and she told me she was scared too. Thank you for showing us that difficult conversations can lead to deeper connection." "That's exactly why we do this," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "To help people understand that struggle doesn't mean failure." David appeared in the doorway, his medical school acceptance letter in hand and a grin on his face. "Northwestern, full scholarship. And they specifically mentioned my published paper on family dynamics in medical settings in their acceptance letter." "The paper I helped you write," Eleanor said, beaming with pride. "The paper we wrote together," David corrected gently. "I provided the research, you provided the wisdom." Maya looked up from her laptop, her own acceptance letter from Northwestern, her second-choice school that had become her first choice after writing her honest essay, propped against her water bottle. "I still can't believe we're both going to be in Chicago next year. And I can't believe you're both going to be far away from me," Eleanor said, but her voice carried joy rather than sadness. "Though I'm proud of you for choosing schools based on their programs rather than their proximity to home." "We learned that from you," David replied, "about how love means supporting people's growth, even when their growth takes them away from you." Rebecca entered the room with a stack of printed pages, responses from their blog readers that she'd been compiling for their monthly review. "I have updates from 3 different families who've started having, quote, difficult conversation dinners after reading our post about honest communication." Eleanor laughed, remembering the evening they'd coined that term. "I love that other families are discovering what we learned, that avoiding difficult topics doesn't make them go away, it just makes them more powerful." "Speaking of which," Maya said, closing her laptop and looking around at her family, "I have something difficult to say." Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of apprehension, but this time it was tempered by confidence in their family's ability to handle whatever came next. I've been thinking about next year, about leaving for college, and I realize I'm not scared anymore. Maya continued. Not scared of leaving, not scared of losing you, not scared of change. And I think that's because of what we learned from our crisis. What did we learn? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. That love doesn't require proximity. That connection can survive difficulty. That families can grow stronger by facing truth together instead of protecting each other from it. David nodded thoughtfully. Maya's right. Before, I was always trying to fix things, to make everything smooth and easy. Now I understand that the goal isn't to eliminate difficulty, it's to face it together. Rebecca moved to stand behind Eleanor's chair, her hands resting on her mother's shoulders in a gesture that had become their family's signature of support. And I learned that caring for someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. It means being present for their journey while still honoring your own needs. Eleanor looked around at her family, seeing them clearly, in a way that would have been impossible before Maya's devastating question had forced them all to confront their fears and assumptions. I learned that the question isn't whether life is difficult, Eleanor said slowly. The question is whether we choose to find meaning in the difficulty. Whether we choose to grow from our struggles or be diminished by them. And we chose to grow, Maya said firmly. We chose to grow, Eleanor agreed. And we chose to help others grow from their struggles too. David pulled out his phone and began reading from their blog statistics. We've had over 50,000 unique visitors in the past 3 months. The post about living with limitation has been shared over 2,000 times. Quote, "The comments on that post always make me cry," Rebecca added. So many people saying they felt permission to acknowledge their own struggles for the first time. Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she reflected on their journey. You know what I'm most proud of? Not that we survived our crisis, but that we transformed it into something that helps others. What's next for the weight of words? Maya asked. Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with possibility. I think we keep doing what we've been doing. We keep sharing our story, keep learning from other families, keep growing together even when we're apart. And we keep being honest, David added, about the hard parts and the beautiful parts and everything in between. Because that's what saved us, Rebecca said. The decision to stop pretending everything was fine and start working with what was real. Eleanor reached for the leather journal that had started it all, the one filled with letters she'd written to be read after I'm gone. She opened it to the first page and began reading her own words from months earlier. If you're reading this, then the inevitable has finally happened, and I hope you'll forgive an old woman's need to have the last word. She looked up at her family, her voice strong and clear. I never want anyone to have to forgive me for having the last word. I want to use my words while I'm here, while I can still participate in the conversation, while I can still contribute to the dialogue. And you have, Maya said, her voice filled with love and admiration. You've used your words to teach us about resilience, about love, about the possibility of transformation even in the darkest moments. Eleanor closed the journal and set it aside. Then let's keep talking. Let's keep writing. Let's keep choosing words that heal instead of words that wound. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, Eleanor looked around at her family, her collaborators, her teachers, her greatest accomplishment, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. Maya's cruel question had shattered their comfortable illusions, but from those shattered pieces, they'd built something stronger than what they'd had before. The weight of words, Eleanor said, speaking to her family and to the thousands of readers who had joined their conversation, is not just in their power to hurt, but in their power to heal. And sometimes, the most healing words are the ones that are hardest to speak. She picked up her pen and turned to a fresh page in her journal, ready to write the next chapter of their story. Not a story about ending, but a story about beginning again, about choosing life over fear, about the endless possibility of love that refuses to give up. The grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, marking not just the passage of time but the continuation of a conversation that had saved them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,